As you can imagine, I am feeling very self-conscious. I've been thinking about this feeling for a few weeks now, and I want to invite you tonight to share as much of this feeling with me as you can. I want you to think, that is, as deeply as possible, about why and how you exist. My aim is similar to that thought experiment you may have heard, which bids you have been told the date of your death, a week, a month, a year from now, and to let that thought impart its sudden wisdom and the clear, unobstructed view that it gives you of what matters. As Samuel Johnson put it, when a man knows that he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. We all know that we will die. Mercifully, most of us have not been given the date. Is there a way of concentrating the mind so wonderfully without a fictional, much less a real date certain for the end of our life? I think there is, in what St. Augustin of Hippo describes as becoming a problem to oneself. That is, rather than taking life for granted and concentrating on its meaning in view of its imminent end, we ask, why life at all? What am I? What are we that we exist? This is what Augustin describes as doing the hard labor in the field of oneself. And it's a hard labor that we do in many ways. But I want to concentrate tonight on one way that we perform this labor, and that is to listen together, carefully, to the dead with our eyes. That is, to enact one of the great miracles of human existence, and to read. Reading gives us access to a vast record of wonder, the fruits of others' labors in the fields of their own selves. To listen to the dead with his eyes is how Francisco de Quevedo, a statesman and man of letters in early 17th century Spain, described his own solitary reading, his way of retreating from the distractions of the world and taking his measure of what mattered. But already in Quevedo's presence, I sensed the labor of becoming a problem to myself through reading, becoming even harder. For in his presence, I overhear his contemporary and his close friend, Miguel de Cervantes, who regales us regularly from beyond his grave with the adventures of the ingenious nobleman of La Mancha, Don Quixote. Don Quixote loved books, so much so that he became one. So enchanted was he by the dragon-slaying, damsel-saving lives of the knights errant in his novels that he began to live his life accordingly, to much comic and poignant effect. Don Quixote is a great novel, in part because it is such a searching examination of the confounding power of books. And of all the technologies that we have created for ourselves, to create ourselves. What I would bid you think at this stage is of our own worry about our own technologies. those that we have created to create ourselves, and how we are afraid that they may be capturing us, that our smartphones are smarter than we are, that they use us more than we use them. Notice, for example, that as I speak, I myself am being captured, rendered into billions of bits of digital information, into a seamless echo of myself to be sent off in a billion different directions into the digiverse. To be thus rendered is why I have rendered myself up onto this stage, to join in a collective effort to create the comforting illusion of an intact, enduring self. Why an illusion? Well, to begin with, this is all supposed to appear effortless. Don't believe it. What's more, as I speak, I myself, unlike my digital echo, cannot be edited or paused or replayed. As I said, I'm feeling self-conscious. In the early 17th century, the popular book was the newest of the technologies of the self. It's not mere whimsy to think of them as the smartphones of the day. Cervantes was fascinated by how this newest technology of the self was insinuating itself into human consciousness, shaping it, and getting between us and the world that we live in. His biggest joke is not on his hapless knight, but on his inattentive readers who are so captivated by Don Quixote's windmill tilting pratfalls, all of his noble absurdity, that they miss that he is always and already no more or less than what he set out to be, and that is the hero of his own book. Words on a page, squiggles of ink on sheets of the dried pulp of rags. I haven't proposed books as a way toward a clearer sense of what meaning our lives have, only to reject them. Rather, what I want to do is suggest how great art of any kind simultaneously enchants us and reveals its own artifice. It distracts us from ourselves and confronts us with ourselves simultaneously with the question, why is it we create illusions to come to terms with our reality? What kind of thing am I that anything matters to me at all? It's always been thus and always will be thus. 2,000 years before Don Quixote sprang from Cervantes' brow, armed with some of the sharpest irony ever forged. The great philosophical ironist, Socrates, was warning us against reading of any kind. Books, he observed, don't teach you much of anything at all. When you ask them a question, they just keep saying the same thing. It's hard to know who's even speaking in a book. Socrates himself being a case in point. Socrates never wrote a word. He did all of his philosophizing in conversation. His conversations were reported for us by his student Plato, sometimes long after they had occurred, and sometimes in ways they could not have occurred. Socrates and Plato together make one of the great ventriloquist acts of history. But Socrates did not have time for books, he said, because he had dedicated himself to following the inscription on the temple of the oracle at Delphi that bids us to know thyself, Of course, Plato is having a little joke, because Socrates, to know himself, merely would have had to take up the book that Plato had made him into and read. But Socrates does not have time for books, in part because he knows that he will die. He only has a certain amount of time with himself. We know, as Plato's readers, that he will die, famously, at the hands of the Athenian people, executed for corrupting the city's youth, among them Plato. Just to point out, Don Quixote will be that man whose mind and heart are so wonderfully concentrated in view of his own death. But on the day of his death, Socrates tells those who have come to comfort him to themselves be comforted. With wondrous equanimity, he says to them that he has been practicing all along for that very day. Philosophizing, he tells them, is nothing more than practicing to die. What he means by this is that he has been separating the things of his mind which last, his ideas, from his body, which does not and will perish. What may matter more to us is his manner of philosophizing. In a word, it is to wonder. In a phrase, to become a problem to himself and to make problems of themselves to others. He asked questions, persistent, searching questions. How do I know? What is virtue? How should I act? So persistent and searching were his questions that some have said that that may be one reason he was executed. But am I asking us all to become like Socrates, paragons of determined reason and of stoic detachment? Not exactly. Socrates does exemplify the peaceful dignity and the ethical acuity of the examined life. But in his wondering about that life, he falls short. Because we are bodies. We do feel and are sometimes overcome by feeling. We want ways of wondering about ourselves that deal with all the dimensions of our existence. And so I turn to conclude to one last figure in the record of wonder in books, and that is Job. Job, you'll recall, was the man of many sorrows, blameless in the eyes of God, and yet who suffers most greatly, losing everything he has almost at a blow. His farm, his family, his friends, his health, all gone, as the story goes, because his God decided to test his faith. Would Job curse God and die? No. When Job's comforters come to him, he does not curse God and die. He curses the day of his birth. Job wishes that he had never existed. That is terrible suffering. To live a life that you don't think is worth living. I do wonder how that feels. And in wondering how that feels, I have to ask myself what it is I've been given in my consciousness to myself. What am I to myself that I exist? And in asking these questions, I think that we are not being selfish. Because to ask them, we have to have sympathized with Job to the very point that he wishes that he had not existed. Consider not having existed. It's very difficult to think, but it's possible. We are surrounded, in a way, by those who haven't. Job wishes he were among them. But we can comfort ourselves by knowing that in Job we are dealing ultimately with a book. As the book of Job falls away, we can wonder at our own capacity for sympathy. And finally, we can wonder at our ability to wonder at all. For to wonder is the only answer that Job gets to his suffering. After much wordy wrangling with his righteous friends who have come to explain his suffering to Job, Job says, at last, "Why me? Why have I suffered?" And the answer that he gets in the form of a whirlwind with God's voice is not a justification. It's not an explanation of Job's suffering. It is a litany of questions. Questions of the kind that no one will be able ever to answer. The first of which is, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth?" I think that all any of us can answer is that we are here now. And that is wonderful.